I ruin men, Apache woman said to the widowed rancher, who then would protect her for life. The wind always came first in the evening. It pushed across the dry grass in long silver waves and carried the smell of dust and warm stone. Daniel Mercer could tell the time of day by the sound of it alone. After his wife died, he stopped using clocks much. There wasn't anyone waiting for dinner anymore, and cattle never cared about hours, only water and grass. The ranch sat far from town, tucked between low hills and a shallow canyon that cut across the land like an old scar. The place had belonged to his wife's family long before paved roads reached the county. When she was alive, the house felt smaller because it held two people's voices. Now it felt too big even when every door was closed. Daniel worked longer days than necessary. People in town assumed he did it to keep the ranch running. The truth was simpler. Work made noise, and noise kept memories from talking too loudly. That afternoon the heat held on longer than usual. Even after the sun dipped lower, the ground still breathed warmth upward. Daniel carried a toolbox toward the far fence line where one of the water troughs had cracked along its side. The cattle had been pacing around it since morning, confused by the leaking stream forming a muddy patch nearby. He knelt beside the trough, ran a hand over the split metal, and sighed. Another repair. Another evening spent outside. The sky turned orange behind the hills while he tightened bolts and sealed the seam. A hawk circled overhead once, then disappeared. The world felt wide and empty, the way it often did when the day faded. He noticed her when he stood to stretch his back. At first he thought she was a post or shadow near the fence line across the boundary. She stood still enough that she blended with the upright shapes of dry shrubs, but then she shifted her weight slightly and the light caught her face. A woman. She stood several yards away on the other side of the wire fence near the beginning of the canyon land. No vehicle nearby, no dust trail from walking the road, just there as if she had been watching for a long time. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and glanced around instinctively, half expecting someone else to appear. No one did. "Evening," he called out. The wind carried his voice unevenly. For a moment she didn't answer, and he wondered if she understood him at all. Then she stepped closer to the fence, not close enough to threaten, just enough to show she meant to speak. "You should not stay here after dark," she said calmly. Her English was careful, deliberate, each word placed like a stone in a path. Daniel leaned an elbow on the trough. "Coyotes don't scare me much," she shook her head once. "Not coyotes." He studied her then. She looked young but carried herself with an older stillness, the kind people earned from watching more than talking. Her dark hair was tied loosely behind her back, and dust clung to the hem of her skirt from walking the rough ground. "Storm coming?" he asked. "No storm." He waited, but she didn't continue. The wind rattled the fence wire between them. Daniel picked up his canteen and took a drink before holding it out across the fence. "You walked a long way. Water's clean." She looked at the canteen but didn't reach for it. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "I ruin men. Every man who tries to keep me loses something." For a moment Daniel thought she might be joking, but her face held no hint of humor. Just certainty, the kind that didn't need explaining. He almost laughed, not at her but at the strange honesty of it. The words sounded serious, yet they landed on a life already stripped down. "Ma'am," he said gently, "there's not much left here worth ruining." Her eyes studied him longer this time, as if measuring whether he believed his own answer. "You live alone," she said. "Yes. You had a wife." He stiffened slightly. The small cemetery marker near the cottonwood tree was visible from where they stood if someone knew to look. He wondered how long she had been coming near the property. "Yes," he said again, softer. She gave a small nod, not apology exactly, more recognition. "You should still leave this place at night," she repeated. Daniel capped the canteen and set it on the trough. "I've been staying here a long time. I'll manage." Neither moved for several seconds. The sky darkened toward purple, and the first evening chill crept into the air. Finally, she turned away without another word and walked along the fence line toward the canyon. Her steps were steady and unhurried. Within moments, she blended into the dim land until only empty space remained. Daniel stood there longer than he intended. He finished the repair after sunset and returned to the house with a feeling he couldn't name. Not fear, just the sense that the land had briefly spoken and then gone quiet again. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee grounds from morning. He reheated leftover stew, ate standing at the counter, and kept glancing toward the dark window above the sink. No movement outside. He told himself strangers sometimes crossed the outer boundary. The land stretched for miles. Hikers and wanderers appeared occasionally. Yet none had ever approached that way without road or sound, and none had warned him about staying. That night he slept lighter than usual. The next day passed normally. Feed, check fences, haul supplies from the shed. By late afternoon, he almost forgot the encounter entirely until he walked toward the same trough carrying replacement washers. She stood there again. Same place, same quiet posture. He didn't seem surprised this time, only curious. "You came back," he said. She gave a small shrug. "I walk here." "Well, the trough works now," he replied. "No more leaks." She glanced at the repaired seam and nodded approvingly, as if it mattered more than conversation. Daniel rested his arms on the fence. "Got a name?" She hesitated briefly. "Iana." "Daniel." She looked toward the hills rather than at him. "You stayed. Like I said I would." The wind lifted loose strands of her hair. For the first time he noticed she seemed less like someone visiting and more like someone who belonged to the land behind her. He held out the canteen again. This time she accepted it. She took one drink and handed it back. "Thank you," she said. It was the first normal sentence she had spoken to him. They stood in silence afterward, not uncomfortable. The quiet felt different now, shared rather than empty. As the sun lowered again, she spoke once more. "I warned you." Daniel nodded. "I heard you." She studied him as if she expected him to change his mind at any moment. When he didn't, she turned and began walking back toward the canyon. But before disappearing, she paused and looked over her shoulder. "You are stubborn," she said. Daniel allowed a faint smile. "So I've been told." She vanished into the fading light, and for the first time since his wife's passing, the ranch did not feel quite as lonely when night arrived. The next morning, Daniel woke earlier than usual. For months he had been rising with the sun out of habit, not purpose. But that day he stepped outside before the sky fully brightened, as if he expected to see someone standing near the fence again. The land stretched quiet and empty. Only the cattle moved slowly through the pale light. He almost laughed at himself. People passed through ranch land sometimes. It didn't mean anything. Still, as he walked toward the barn, he noticed something unusual. The side gate he had forgotten to secure the night before was closed properly. He stopped. He was certain he had left it open while hauling feed. He remembered clearly because he planned to return with a hammer and fix the loose hinge. Yet now it sat aligned perfectly, even the rope tied tighter than he usually managed. He untied it and examined the knot. It wasn't his style, cleaner, practical. Daniel looked toward the canyon. Nothing moved. He shook his head and continued chores, telling himself he must have fixed it without remembering. Days blended together lately. Small details slipped. But that afternoon he discovered something harder to ignore. One of the younger calves had wandered beyond the grazing patch, a common problem. Usually he spent an hour tracking hoof marks across the dry ground. Today he followed the prints only a short distance before noticing the calf already standing beside the main herd, nudged gently into place by careful rock arrangements guiding its path back through a natural gap in brush. Someone had herded it without touching it. Daniel rested his hands on his hips, studying the makeshift trail. Whoever did it understood animals. Not random wandering, deliberate thinking. He didn't need to guess who. Toward evening he carried a small bag of apples to the trough. He wasn't sure why, the thought simply felt reasonable. She appeared not long after the shadows lengthened. "You helped with the calf," he said before greeting. Iana looked at the ground. "It would have walked far. I would have found it." She gave a slight nod, but her eyes said she knew the search would have taken hours. He set the apples on the trough edge. "They grow near the river north of town, not many left this season." She examined them, uncertain. "You do not have to give things." "I know." After a pause, she picked one up. "I did not change anything," she added quietly. "I only moved what was already there." Daniel leaned against the metal side. "Seems you know this land well. My family walked here before fences." The statement held no bitterness, just fact. He looked out across the pasture. "Then you probably know more about it than I do?" For the first time, a faint smile touched her expression, very small, almost cautious. They spoke little more that evening, but the silence no longer felt like strangers watching each other. It felt like two people sharing the same horizon. Over the next week she returned often, never at the same hour but always near sunset. Sometimes she stayed only minutes, sometimes longer. She never entered the yard without permission, never approached the house. Yet her presence changed things. The cattle became calmer along the canyon boundary. Broken fence posts appeared temporarily supported before Daniel reached them. Once he found a bucket placed beneath a slow pipe drip, preventing a muddy mess he would have noticed days later. He tried to thank her, but she always answered the same way. "I only see what needs doing." The ranch, which had been slowly declining since Leela's passing, began improving in quiet ways. Not dramatic, just fewer problems, fewer wasted hours. Then the trouble started. It began with the tractor. Daniel had used the old machine for years without serious issue. One morning while hauling hay, the rear axle snapped clean despite no heavy load. The brake looked unnatural, as if metal had grown tired all at once. Repairs cost money he had carefully saved. He told himself equipment eventually failed. Nothing lasted forever. 2 days later, a cattle buyer from town arrived to finalize a deal they had discussed for weeks. The agreement would have carried Daniel through winter comfortably. But the man walked the herd, frowned, and shook his head. "They look unsettled," he said. "Not sick, just off. I'll wait another month." Another month meant risk. Daniel watched the truck drive away in a cloud of dust. When he turned back toward the pasture, he noticed Ayana standing far off near the canyon rocks, not approaching. That evening she didn't come to the trough. The third event felt stranger. Lightning struck the far grazing patch during a perfectly clear afternoon. A single bolt from a cloudless sky, scorching a circle of dry grass no wider than a barn floor. No fire spread, but the burn marked the earth sharply. Neighbors later said they heard thunder miles away, though no storm ever appeared. Town talk grew quickly in small places. At the supply store, an older rancher asked Daniel quietly, "You been keeping company near the canyon?" Daniel paused. "I've met someone who walks there." The man nodded slowly. "Just be careful, some folks carry more history than others." Daniel didn't answer. Yana returned the next day, but she stopped farther from the fence than before. "You should not stand close to me now," she said. "Because of my tractor?" he asked. She did not look surprised. He connected the timing. "Where I stay," she said softly, "life changes." Not always gentle. He studied her expression, not threatening, not proud, only worried. "You think you caused it?" "I do not cause," she replied, "but change follows." Daniel picked up a rock and rolled it beneath his boot. "My life changed long before you came." She remained silent. After a moment he continued, voice steady. "Bad luck happens on ranches every year. Machines break, buyers hesitate, weather does strange things." "You believe that?" she said, almost questioning. "Yes." She finally stepped closer to the fence again, though not as near as before. "I have walked many places," she said. "Men try to keep me near. Then something important leaves them, work, land, family. They blame other reasons, but I see the pattern." Daniel folded his arms on the fence rail. "Maybe you just arrive when life's already shifting." She looked directly at him for the first time that day. "You do not fear losing more?" He thought about the quiet house, the empty chair, the evenings measured by wind. "There's less to lose than you think." The answer seemed to unsettle her more than rejection would have. They stood together until sunset painted the hills red. Before leaving, she placed something on the trough, a small braided cord made of plant fibers. "For the gate hinge," she said. "It will hold longer than rope." He nodded. "Thank you," she hesitated. "I should come less." "You'll do what you decide," he replied gently. She walked away slowly, as if expecting him to stop her. He didn't, but he also didn't tell her not to return. That night the wind sounded different again. Not louder, not softer, just shared, like the land now carried 2 sets of footsteps instead of one. Summer settled heavily over the land. By midday the air shimmered above the ground, and even the cattle searched for thin strips of shade beside the fence posts. Daniel adjusted his routine, waking earlier and resting during the hottest hours. The ranch moved slower in that season, but it also carried a quiet tension, the kind that came when the earth waited for something to change. Yana came less often now. Some evenings she appeared only long enough to make sure the animals had water and then left without speaking much. Other days she did not come at all. Daniel didn't ask why. He had learned she spoke when she chose to, not when someone pressed her. Still, he noticed the difference. The land felt watchful. One afternoon, a white truck rolled down the long dirt road leading toward the canyon boundary. Dust rose behind it like a long tail. Daniel stepped out from the barn, shading his eyes. Visitors were rare unless someone was lost. The truck stopped near the outer fence. Two men climbed out, wearing bright vests and carrying measuring poles and equipment cases. They looked around as if the hills belonged to paperwork instead of wind. Daniel walked over slowly. "Afternoon," he said. One of them nodded politely. "We're doing a land survey company project." "What kind of project?" "Mineral assessment," the man replied, already checking a tablet. "Just preliminary markings." They placed small flags into the ground every few yards, creating a line that cut straight toward the canyon. Daniel followed their path with his eyes and felt a faint unease. "That line runs through grazing land," he said. "Temporary," the man answered. "Official boundaries will be confirmed later." Daniel didn't like the sound of that. He watched them work until they drove away, leaving colored markers fluttering in the dry breeze. The hills looked different with those thin flags standing where nothing had stood before, like the land had been divided without asking. That evening, Ayanna did not come, nor the next. On the third day, Daniel found her tracks near the canyon rocks, but no sign of her. The cattle were restless, gathering away from that direction as if avoiding it. He felt a pressure he couldn't explain, like waiting for thunder without clouds. It happened late one night. Daniel woke to the sound of horses shifting sharply in the corral. Not panic exactly, but alertness. He grabbed his lantern and stepped outside. The sky held a pale moon, lighting the pasture in silver. Then he heard footsteps beyond the fence. Quick, uneven. He moved toward the sound and saw a figure approaching from the canyon side. As she stepped closer, the lantern light revealed Ayanna. Dust covered her clothes and a thin line of blood marked her forearm. He opened the gate immediately. "What happened?" She didn't answer at first, catching her breath. Her calm was still there, but strained. "Men came," she said quietly. "From the survey company. They do not want me near the canyon." Daniel frowned. "They chased you," she nodded once. "They said the land will belong to them soon. They marked areas and told me to leave." He guided her to the porch steps and set the lantern down. "Sit," she hesitated. "I should not bring this here." "You're already here," he said gently. He brought water and a clean cloth. The cut wasn't deep, but had bled from contact with rock while she fled through rough ground. As he cleaned it, she watched the dark pasture rather than him. "You must stay out of this," she said. "My trouble spreads." Daniel wrapped the cloth carefully around her arm. "People don't own the right to chase others across open land." "They believe papers make truth," she replied softly. He leaned back against the porch post. "Then we'll see what truth actually says." Her expression tightened slightly. "If you stand with me, you lose peace." Daniel looked toward the quiet house behind him. For a moment he remembered long evenings with Leela's voice filling the rooms, laughter, ordinary talk about nothing important. Peace had left long ago. "I've been living without peace," he said. "Just quiet." The horses settled, sensing calm return. Night insects hummed across the grass. She studied him, searching his face as if expecting hesitation. When none came, she lowered her gaze. "They will come again," she said. "Then we'll talk to them properly next time." The next morning, Daniel drove her to the small clinic nearly 40 miles away. The nurse cleaned the wound and bandaged it better than he could. Ayanna answered questions simply and avoided giving more details than needed. On the drive back, she watched the passing desert carefully. "You did not have to help," she said. He kept his eyes on the road. "You warned me already, remember?" A faint breath of a laugh escaped her, the first he had heard from her. "Yes," she said. "You stayed anyway." When they reached the ranch, 2 new trucks waited near the fence. Men stood beside them holding folders and maps. Daniel parked slowly. "Looks like they came sooner." Ayanna grew still but did not step back. One of the men approached. "Sir, we need to discuss access to this section. The company now has temporary rights to begin testing." Daniel crossed his arms. "This is private grazing land." "Documentation suggests overlapping claims," the man replied calmly. "We'll settle it legally, but work begins soon." Ayanna spoke quietly beside him. "This ground holds burial markers older than your records." The man glanced at her briefly, uncomfortable but firm. "Ma'am, please allow official channels to handle that." Daniel noticed the line of flags stretching farther now, cutting deeper toward the canyon. Something had shifted beyond chance. He looked at Ayanna, then back at the men. "All right," he said steadily. "Then we'll handle it officially." As the trucks drove away again, dust rising behind them, he understood this would not end quickly. Ayanna stood beside him, silent. For the first time since she had appeared near his fence, the future of the land, and both their lives, felt tied together in a way neither could quietly walk away from. Word spread through the county faster than Daniel expected. By the end of the week, people in town already knew survey trucks had reached the canyon land. Some treated it as opportunity. Others treated it as trouble waiting to happen. The cafe owner asked careful questions. The feed supplier simply shook his head and said paperwork always favored whoever printed more of it. Daniel had never spent much time dealing with offices and legal matters. Ranching meant fixing fences, checking water lines, and watching weather patterns, not reading long documents. But now envelopes began arriving in his mailbox almost daily. Most carried official stamps. He read them slowly at the kitchen table each night. The language felt heavy and distant, full of terms that described the land as numbers rather than hills and paths. Several letters mentioned overlapping historical claims and pending review. One advised he should consider legal representation if he wished to challenge the survey boundaries. He drove into town the next morning. The lawyer's office sat between a hardware store and an insurance agency. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Daniel explained the situation carefully, leaving out nothing: the markers, the company trucks, and the canyon area Ayanna said belonged to her ancestors. The lawyer listened without interruption. "You're not just dealing with a property line," the man finally said. "This touches protected cultural ground if records confirm it," Daniel nodded. "Then it needs to be looked at properly." The lawyer leaned back. "You understand that could affect your own acreage too. How much? Possibly several grazing sections." That meant fewer cattle. Less income, harder winters. Daniel considered it only briefly. If the boundary was wrong, then it was wrong. The lawyer studied him, perhaps expecting hesitation. When none came, he opened a folder and began preparing documents. Ayanna waited near the outer fence when Daniel returned that evening. She seemed to know where he had gone without asking. "You spoke to someone," she said. "Yes." She watched him carefully. "This path takes time. I'm not in a hurry." She hesitated before stepping closer to the fence than she had in days. "If the land is recognized, you lose part of your pasture." "I know." Her brow tightened. "You worked years for this place, and your family walked it longer." The answer left her quiet. For a long moment they stood facing the same stretch of ground, a patch of dry grass and scattered stones that looked ordinary but now carried weight neither could ignore. "I tried to keep distance so you would not be pulled into this," she said softly. Daniel rested his arms on the top wire. "You didn't pull me, I walked." The process moved slowly. Weeks turned into months of small steps. Officials visited the canyon with measuring equipment and cameras. They examined weathered rock markings and shallow depressions in the earth that Daniel had always assumed were natural shapes. Ayanna explained them carefully, places of memory rather than decoration. Some people in town supported the review. Others worried outside companies might leave entirely if restricted, taking future jobs with them. Conversations became cautious whenever Daniel entered a room. He didn't argue with anyone. He only answered when asked. The ranch changed during that time. With fewer hours spent grazing the contested area, Daniel adjusted his herd size. It meant selling several cattle earlier than planned. The payment covered basic costs but left little extra. He repaired old fencing instead of replacing it and postponed equipment upgrades. One evening, while he calculated expenses at the table, he noticed a bundle placed near the door, dried herbs and woven fibers. Ayanna's quiet way of helping without interfering. She never offered money or asked about his losses. She simply worked alongside the land so less went wrong. He carried the bundle outside and found her sitting near the fence. "You don't need to bring things," he said. "I bring balance," she answered. He sat on the porch step. "Lawyer says hearings may take several more months." She nodded. "Time decides truth better than anger." He watched the sun lowering behind the hills. "You've waited longer than I have." She didn't reply immediately. "My grandmother waited her whole life for someone to listen. I am only continuing." The hearing finally arrived late autumn. The building felt colder than the weather outside. Papers stacked high on long tables, people speaking in careful tones. Daniel wore his cleanest shirt, though dust never fully left ranch clothes. Ayanna stood beside him, calm but distant, as if remembering many voices before this one. Records were presented, maps drawn decades apart, old photographs, tribal documents, and corrected survey measurements. Experts explained how earlier lines had been marked with limited tools, leaving small but important errors. Daniel listened closely even when the details became technical. The land he worked every day now existed as diagrams under bright lights. During a break, the lawyer spoke quietly to him. There's strong evidence supporting protected status for the canyon section. And my pasture, likely reduced. Daniel nodded once. The answer settled in him without surprise. When proceedings resumed, Ayanna was asked to speak. She did so simply, not dramatically, describing paths her family walked, seasonal water flow, and how certain stones aligned with sunrise during specific times of year. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. By evening, the decision was announced. The canyon and adjoining ground were officially recognized as protected ancestral land. Survey work would stop. The company would withdraw operations from that area. Daniel's grazing boundary shifted inward accordingly. The room filled with mixed reactions, relief from some, disappointment from others. Daniel only looked at the map one last time, adjusting his understanding of home. Outside, the air carried winter's first chill. Ayanna stood beside him near the steps, eyes reflecting something softer than he had ever seen there. "You gave up part of your living place," she said. "I kept what matters," he replied. She shook her head slightly. "Most would not choose this." Daniel looked across the darkening hills. Most people still have someone waiting at home, makes decisions different. For the first time, she reached out and placed her hand lightly against the fence post between them. "I will not forget," she said. He gave a small nod. "You don't have to repay anything." "I know," she answered. "That is why it matters." The wind moved through the grass again, carrying winter with it. The land looked smaller on paper now, yet somehow steadier, as if something unsettled had finally been placed where it belonged.